right. We are live this evening. Thanks to all of you who come out. Thanks to you who view the streams. We appreciate your support. We are in the book of Isaiah. Let me make sure our sound is good. Yeah, we are good. All right. Isaiah chapter 53, and we are looking about this subject of he is despised and rejected of men. You know, it's interesting because, as a general rule, people don't like to be despised and rejected. It is much easier and much more common for someone to want to be part of the in crowd, to want to do what's popular. And so you see that in our culture. There's a bit of popularity that goes on. Or maybe you would refer to it as trends or styles. There are things that become very common within a nation, or perhaps within a city, or within a state, or within a family. There is something that becomes kind of the normal. I remember it was several years ago. I say several because I think I was in high school. So this is a lot of years ago, about 20 years ago. I remember one of my uncles, my Uncle Lewis, got himself a swimming pool. And that kind of became now the new in thing to do, and it wasn't too long before my Uncle Danny got a swimming pool, and not too long after that, my Uncle Jimmy got a swimming pool. That kind of became the in thing, the popular thing to do. And of course now I think only one of them still has it. But we look at these different things, and there are things that people do. They want to fit in. This is especially true in schools. You see it all the time. Elementary school, middle school, high school, even into college. People do things to fit in. You generally do things that your friends tend to do. You know, if your friends wear a certain brand, maybe it'll be that you wear the same brand. If your friends root for a certain sports team, you'll likely root for the same sports team. Why? Because you're trying to fit in. Now, if there's anything that causes you to not fit in, then it becomes really questionable. And then it becomes whether or not we're being accepted with whatever it is that we're doing that's different. Perhaps you've met someone that went to purple hair or pink hair or something like that. They've went with outlandish jewelry, perhaps. Things to try to be noticed that are a little different, but they still really want to fit in. Besides, if someone that's doing something is different, if people begin to say things against them, they typically begin to be offended, and they get upset with you. You know, probably we see this very commonly in our culture today, where there are people that are part of group, they sometimes say alternative lifestyles or alternative viewpoints, and they get very upset if someone contradicts their lifestyle. Why? Because they want to do what's different and still fit in. And it's interesting when Jesus begins to talk about this. Because Jesus talks about this. He talks about how that there were people that were despising and rejecting him. They were despising and rejecting him, he said, because they don't know me and they don't know my Father. And he says, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. And when we look at Isaiah chapter 53, we don't find that Jesus lives an amazingly simple lifestyle, that there were never any problems, that he always had the things that he needed to deal with the things that he was facing. No, we find many times there was a lack. There was a lack of food sometimes. We see this very plainly. One day that Jesus was hungry, and he comes to a fig tree, and the fig tree's not ripe yet. All right, we find this, he's not being accepted. He goes into the temple, and he finds people that are selling oxen and sheep, and they're basically money loans and things. It says the money changers. and he turns over everything and throws them out, it tells us. And then they wanted to have a sign. They didn't accept who he was. Ultimately, Jesus was so despised and rejected that he would come before Pilate, and Pilate would even seek to release him, saying, how about we release Barabbas? And he would be so despised and rejected that they would choose to allow Jesus to die rather to let a murderer be released. So we find the situation. He's not a man that was accepted. He was despised. He says he was acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. You know, there's a chorus that is often sung. It says, oh, to be like Jesus. Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, pure as thou art. Oh, to be like thee. There's also another chorus that says, more of thee, Lord. It says, more of thee. I want more of thee, so I'll give him more of me and all of me. All right, but I want you to understand what that identification is. When we become identified with something, it then becomes a marker of our life. So, for example, if we identify and play a certain game, we'll be identified with that game. This is a game that this person plays. If we are fans of a certain sports team, we now identify with that sports team, and someone realizes that we know and at least care in some form about this team. Or when we get involved with the workplace, we identify with that workplace. Now, the uniforms that we wear, the things that we do, they reflect that we are identifying with that workplace. And so for myself, obviously, we are employed at Heartland Automotive. And we're also the pastor of this church. And we identify with a particular church. They become the markers of our life. Our family becomes the marker of our lives. Obviously, if my wife and I are an Bowden wife, my wife identifies with me. And my two little girls. Obviously, one of them is getting to know that identification a little bit. She's only a month into the world. But obviously, Lily identifies with her daddy. And Isabella sort of kind of does too. She follows my eyes a little bit. She's still a little young yet. But there's an identification. There's a marker. There are things about us that people realize. You know, I was in high school. I was noted heavily for being a chess player and being on the academic team. And for a little while I played football. We're identified. They're markers on our life. All right? They become things that identify us. Those identifications have an impact. All right? Obviously, the identification I'm making with my family says that I am the provider for them. I'm their father. I'm the one that's there to help them and to meet their needs. All right, that's an identification I'm taking on as being the father. All right, I've taken on an identification at my work that this is the place where I'm going to work, and I'm going to follow the schedule they set up for me and come in when they tell me I need to come in and go home when they tell me I need to go home. All right, I've made an identification with them. I make an identification with my boss that I'm going to follow the things that he wants me to do. I'm making an identification with him. Are we making identification spiritually now? There are one of two things that you are going to likely identify with. One of those is going to be you're going to identify yourself with God, with Jesus, and being a follower of him, and being a Christian. Or you're going to make an identification with the things of the world. That I have chosen to reject God. I have chosen to follow the way that I want to follow. And do what I want to do. And do what the world wants me to do. But I want to tell you what the identification with Jesus means. Because the identification with Jesus is made very clear in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3. Because it tells us he was despised and rejected. All right, I can tell you almost without doubt that you're not going to be very popular, and if you are, it's probably not going to be in a good way if you are a follower of Jesus. All right, look at Jesus' life. All right, he goes up during the Palm Sunday. Everyone's happy. Everyone's excited. They've taken out palm branches. They're strewing them in the way. They're saying, Hosanna, Hosanna. All right, the people are excited. He's popular. They're ready to make him king at that point. But it's only just a week later that they're crying out, away with him, crucify him. You see, he's been rejected. He didn't meet up with the standard that they had for their life. And you're not going to meet up with this world's standards if you follow Jesus. You know why it's not going to be very popular to stand out against the music of this world, the videos of this world, to stand out against the ideals of this world, to go against what the normal mainstream says we're supposed to accept? You know, our current culture in America says that we should accept just about everything. They have even created an acronym for it. You're probably all pretty well aware of it. The LGBTQIA+. That's the identifiers. We're supposed to accept those lifestyles and say that it's fine, that it's okay. Right? And if you don't, then you're intolerant and you're someone that's uncaring and unloving. Why? Because we're not identifying with it. Jesus tells the disciples, you're not going to identify with them. They're going to hate you because they hated me first. He says, the world will hate you because you are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. I have called you out of the world. I want to tell you, Jesus calls people to be different. He calls Christians to be different. There should be a mark identifying with Jesus that makes us different than the world around us. It causes us to choose different actions and have different focuses. And the world can't understand that. And so we find despised, rejection. It says he was acquainted with grief. It's an interesting thing that happens. Acquainted with grief. You know, the devil's not all that interested in your life going well. He's not. He's interested in your life living in a way that dishonors God, that doesn't bring glory and honor to Jesus. All right, and if you're going down that road, the devil's fine with it. He's helping you on your way. Everything is good. But the moment you begin to seek Jesus, you're going to find something. You're going to find that there's acquaintance with grief. Things happen. People face things. Think of my dad's life. Obviously, he was a pastor, thank the Lord. He was a good example for his family. But I will tell you this. My dad was very well acquainted with grief. The very first church that he pastored was sold without anyone making any kind of talk with him or conference with him. They just sold the church. They came in one day, told him the church was sold, and they're closing the church down. That was the first church that my dad was at in Brooksburg, Indiana. Sold it to some person there in the town, I believe. I think it was the guy that owned most of the property on the other. He sold him the stuff, closed the church down, and Dad was without a church. That was the first church. They went to another church, and there was someone that came in, and the church was debating on whether or not Dad was going to be the pastor or this other guy was going to be the pastor that somebody in the church liked. So here they were. They had a big, almost power struggle for almost a year or two. Dad was ready to break down over the whole thing. You see, The devil's not interested in things going well in your life. He's going to bring things into your life where you're going to wonder how you're going to get from one day to the next. There'll be times when you're facing financial difficulty, times when you're facing difficulty with health situations. You know, it's interesting as Peter begins to follow Jesus. We find it's interesting. A lot of people, maybe they realize it. They probably haven't thought about it too much. Peter was actually a married man. We know that for sure because we see almost right off as he begins to follow Jesus that Peter's mother-in-law, which would obviously be his wife's mom, was fallen sick and was very sick. And Jesus comes along, and you know what he does? He comes along Peter and heals his mother-in-law. It's an amazing thing. You know, there's another time where the disciples are struggling. Now, when they're struggling at something that's very important to them, because they're struggling to catch fish. Now, there's one thing you should know. Peter, James, John, it appears even Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, that Thomas also appears to be involved. I'm just bringing in John 21 because it tells us that we have Peter who says he's going fishing. Thomas is going with him. It tells us Nathanael is there, Cana in Galilee. It says the sons of Zebedee were there and two other of his disciples. So we got this group and they're going fishing. Now, the reason why someone goes fishing a lot of times, now maybe it's just for sport, but a lot of times it's because they're trying to catch something, because catching fish was their livelihood. Before Peter becomes a disciple of Jesus, his identity, his marker was being a fisherman. That's what he was known by. That's how he made his money. That was his main thing in life, was to fish. And when Jesus dies on the cross, and then he meets him and raises it again, they're not sure what to do anymore. Their identity's been changed, and Peter's out fishing. But I want to tell you something, that God knew about Peter's fishing trip. And he knew he wasn't going to catch anything. You know what's amazing? Jesus comes on the scene, and it tells us in John chapter 21, he's on the shore. They can't see who it is. They're not real far from shore, but far enough where they can't tell who it is. And Jesus says, "Children, have you any meat?" And they say, no, we haven't caught anything. You know, they're probably pretty frustrated. Somebody on the shore is wanting something. They don't have anything. You know, they're probably thinking, yeah, if we caught something, we could sell to this guy, maybe make some money. No, they don't have anything. But then the man on the shore tells them something that would almost seem absurd. He tells them to cast the net on the right side of the ship, and they would find. Now, I don't think the disciples were all too interested in following this man's advice. All right? But they were probably like, oh, whatever. We haven't caught anything. I just throw it over there and prove to them there's nothing over there. No. And they cast the net over there. No. And it says they caught a great number of fishes, and it tells us a few verses later exactly how many it was. 153. And they weren't just little fish. It says they were great fishes. And it was to the point where John immediately realized it was Jesus. There's no way that it could have been anyone different. And I want to tell you, when God works in our life and begins to work and he becomes the identifying marker in our life, there may well be despised. You may well be rejected. You may well face grief. All right, those were the things that Jesus was acquainted with. He says that he was despised and we esteemed him not. The world may look at you and think, you know what, this guy or this woman just should be wrote off. They don't agree with us. They don't follow us. They're against the things that we go for. Your workplace may reject you. Even your very parents may reject you. Perhaps your kids. Perhaps your cousins or nephews or your friends. You may well be rejected. But I want to tell you, the marker for Jesus was simply this. He followed the will of God. And as he did, God met all of the needs. They're out there fishing. They haven't found anything. Jesus casting out on the right side 153 fish. You know what? God met the need. Oh yeah, they toiled. They struggled all night. God met the need. Peter's mother-in-law is sick, got a fever, not doing well. Jesus comes along and meets the need. Jesus goes to the cross, takes the ultimate sacrifice for mankind, gives the sacrifice for sin, raises from the dead so that we could live. And then he says, listen, follow me. Yeah, there's an interesting thing, and we're closing it. Peter is not sure, these 153 fish, they found them. God's met the financial need there. They realize Jesus is there. He says, come and dine. He's got a fire of coals. There's fish there. There's bread. And then Jesus begins to talk to Peter. Reminds him about the times where he's failed. Those times where he denied him. 3 times. Jesus asked him 3 times, you love me? You love me more than these? Do you really love me? Peter finally is, the 3rd time, he's grieving. He says, Lord, thou knowest all things. You know that I love you. All right, Jesus gives him the command, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. And then he tells him something after this. He says, listen, when you get older, you're going to get hung on a cross for my sake. But then he says, follow me. He doesn't say your life's going to be easy. No, he literally tells him how it's going to be. He says, you're going to lay down your life for my sake. But you're going to identify with me. Follow me. And I'm going to meet the needs of your life. Paul's going to Damascus. He's going there to kill all the Christians. He's got letters from the priest there, the chief priest, to go to Damascus to arrest all the Christians. He's on his way. And all of a sudden, Jesus meets him in the way. Calls out to him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? He's blinded after it. He can't see. He's led by the hand of Damascus. And Ananias is told, go to Paul. He's in the house of Judas. Go there. Says, you're going to pray. You're going to lay your hands on him. You're going to give him his sight. And then he says this, for I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. I want to tell you, following Jesus may not be the easiest road as far as this world's concerned. But it's the road well worth it. Because Jesus is on this road. When we identify with him, and the Spirit of God empowers our life and helps us to live for him. You know what? I want to be identified with Jesus this evening. You want to identify with him. You're going to face some rejection. You're going to be despised a bit. You're going to be acquainted with grief. But I'll tell you this. You're going to find God's presence and the glory of God. And God's glory will shine through us if we'll allow it to. Thanks to all you who come out. Thanks to you who view the streams. We appreciate your support. Pray that you have a wonderful evening in the Lord. Be prayed up, blessed up, and ready to go. Have a wonderful night.